Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this sunny evening, and particularly for braving tube strikes and everything else. I know that George was worried that no one would turn up, but actually, I know from speaking to some of George's students at the Courtauld and from the summer schools, he has quite a strong set of kind of groupies, and so I'm not surprised to see a good set of people here. In a moment, I'm going to introduce George, but before that I just wanted to highlight a couple of events that are coming up that may be of interest to this audience. One is the Courtauld's annual postgraduate symposium, which is taking place next Thursday and Friday. There's a very full programme, very wide-ranging chronologically, but perhaps of particular interest to this audience might be the session at the end of the first day with a series of medieval papers from Courtauld PhD students. And then I also, so that's on the 30th of April and the 1st of May as well. Do look at the website and you can book a slot for that. And then the second event of interest is the annual ICMA lecture delivered in collaboration with the International Centre for Medieval Art, which is on the 20th of May, when William Diebold will be giving a really fascinating looking talk about the trade in medieval Christian and Jewish manuscripts in Nuremberg in the 1950s. So again, you can find all that information, just Google Courtauld Research Forum events, and you can book yourself a place on those. But for this evening, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. George Bartlett. George has been a teaching fellow here at the Courtauld for the last 2.5 years, teaching on our MA and BA programmes. He completed a PhD at the University of Sussex in 2020 and did his own MA here at the Courtauld with Tony Eastmond in 2014-2015. He's been teaching, in fact, in all sorts of different places since then, and today's talk comes partly out of his PhD, which I gather uses Icon really as a kind of vehicle for thinking through broader questions about inscriptions and epigraphy in later Byzantine art. And today he's going to talk to us, I'm going to trip over this word, about At the Name of Jesus Every Knee Should Bow, a Byzantine icon of Christ Pantepoptes and its inscriptions. Thank you, George.
Hi everyone. So as Tom said, thank you for braving the TfL strikes to make it here today. And thank you for indulging me as I talk about one of my favourite niche topics in Byzantine art, naming inscriptions. So buckle up, everyone. In the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, there is a very small but very interesting Byzantine icon, about which virtually nothing is known. We don't know where or when it was made, who made it, how it looked originally, or how it was used. The icon itself is estimated to have been made perhaps in the 14th or 15th century, the so-called twilight years of Byzantium, perhaps in Constantinople. It is made from steatite, which is a soft soapstone, so soft you can scratch it with your fingernail. A material that grew in popularity in Byzantium from around the 10th century. The icon itself is made of 12 small framing plaques and one larger central plaque, which are now fastened to a modern backing. But they once might have been held together with some sort of precious revetment frame, like this one around a steatite icon of St. Demetrius. So blowing the icon up on the screen like this totally distorts its scale. It's a really, really small object. So the central plaque, this one here, measures just 8.8 by 6 centimetres, so about the same size as a credit card. whereas the smaller framing plaques are around 3.5 by 2.7 centimetres, around the same size as a postage stamp. But despite this minute scale, there is a certain monumentality to the icon. Across the 13 plaques, there are about 101 people depicted, not including a few that have been lost over the years. So on the top 2 rows of the outer plaque, we have depictions of Christ blessing prophets on the top row, and beneath that, he blesses the apostles. Then on the row below that, he blesses groups of saints. So we have the church fathers here and here, then military saints, medical saints, and Constantine and Helena there. And then interestingly, on the final plaque, we have an Old Testament scene from the book of Daniel, with 3 Hebrew children being rescued from a fiery furnace by an angel. And moving on to the central plaque, we have 13 scenes depicted. So the outer 12 scenes represent scenes from the life of Christ. So we start with the Annunciation in the top left corner, and then we run through Christ's infancy, ministry, and passion, culminating in a depiction of the Ascension in the bottom right. And these Christological scenes frame a central image of Christ, who is depicted enthroned. He holds an open gospel book that reads a very abbreviated version of John 8:12, I am the light of the world. And in addition to the some 101 figures depicted, we have a huge number of inscriptions too. So in total, there are 84 words inscribed in Byzantine Greek on the epigraphic friezes of the object, totaling 324 characters. And notable for this lecture, in both the icon's imagery and inscriptions, there is a particular focus on Christ. So his naming inscriptions take up 40 of the 84 inscribed words, while the rest are used to name the choirs of saints and prophets and Christological scenes in the outer plaque, the central plaque. And in this icon, all non-narrative representations of Christ are inscribed with his usual insignia, so the Greek letters iota, sigma, chi sigma, which look like the English letters I, C, X, and C, which is basically an abbreviated form of his name. But as well as this, we get a series of epithets and descriptive titles too. So in the centre, on a high-backed throne, we have an image of power and authority. And here Christ is inscribed Pantepoptes, the all-seeing. And if we move to the outer frame, on the top rows of the outer plaques, he is Christ Emmanuel, which means God with us. And beneath that, for the church fathers and the military saints, he is Jesus Christ Nika, which means Jesus Christ conquers. Whereas when we get to the final plaques with Constantine and Helena and the medical saints, he is simply inscribed with his standard name, Jesus Christ. So it might be a helpful diagram for you to work out the spread of all the inscriptions. And these naming inscriptions are points of interest because epithets and additional descriptive names, such as Pantepoptes, Emmanuel, and Nika, are far rarer inscriptions in Byzantine art and have not really been looked at in any detail in Byzantine art scholarship. So in this lecture, I propose that these naming inscriptions are an important, underutilized, and often misunderstood tool for approaching this icon and similar objects where Christ receives other naming inscriptions. And I'll do this by showing the ways in which this object is part of wider epigraphic and onomastic ideologies in Middle and Late Byzantium, where particular meaning is attached to Christ's name and its theological function. And this is important because it allows us to situate this and other icons in kind of wider theological and artistic frameworks, where naming practices are central to our understanding of the function of Christ's image in Byzantine culture. And furthermore, I will go on to show how such inscriptions worked as devotional tools, in that by naming Christ, you could cultivate and communicate a special relationship you have with him, both publicly and privately. And ultimately, in light of examining Christ's naming inscriptions on this large scale, I'll show that the words we, modern viewers, use to describe images of Christ in Byzantium should be more carefully applied. So, let's start unpicking the names of the Pantepoptes icon. First, it's important to ask why the Byzantines bothered to name Christ at all in their art. Clearly, this was not needed for identification purposes, as at this point in Byzantium, most images of Christ look very similar. And I think we can safely say that Christ's image would be instantly recognizable to all visually literate Byzantine viewers. However, in Middle and Late Byzantium, non-narrative images of Christ, like this gorgeous one from the mosaics of Hosius Lukas in Greece, are remarkably consistent in their use of Christ's insignia. So those letters iota, sigma, chi sigma, that look like I, C, X, and C. And as Karen Boston has convincingly shown, the emergence of a standardized naming inscription for Christ was the direct result of the iconoclast era debates that went on in the 8th and 9th centuries. So here it was defined that Christ's image was an effective signpost or window because it shares a formal likeness with the prototype, so the real Christ up in heaven. And this meant that Christ's image was an effective way of showing the real Christ, basically because the two looked the same. However, during the iconoclastic debates, Christ's formal image was not the only subject of discussion. Both the iconoclasts and the iconophiles wrote about the significance of Christ's inscribed name in their respective image theologies. So here, both parties built on earlier Christian writing that described the theological significance of the name Jesus Christ. So for them, Jesus stood for his humanity, in that it was a standard given name, equivalent to Joshua, and Christ stood for his divinity, with Christ meaning Messiah, or anointed one. The iconophile writers, however, went one step further by articulating how naming inscriptions could serve what they call a kind of binding function between Christ's image and the prototype by means of a shared name. So in the Acts of the Seventh Ecumenical Council in 787 CE, where the orthodox function of images was codified for the first time, it was stated, when we signify an icon with a name, we transfer honor to the prototype. Meaning that naming inscriptions were not passive identifiers, but had a very important role in establishing the link between the real Jesus and his represented image, and even underscored how the latter could work. Furthermore, iconophile theologians, such as Patriarch Nicephorus and Theodore the Steatite, adopted Aristotle's concept of homonyms, where two things of a different nature were united by the means of a shared name, i.e. Christ's formal image and the real prototype were bound together by the shared name Jesus Christ. Here, Theodore the Steatite wrote, Christ is one thing, and his image is another thing by nature, although they have an identity in the use of a shared name. And finally, and perhaps more interestingly, Theodore goes beyond Aristotle's philosophies to a Platonic naturalist stance on names, where he describes Christ's written name as a sort of natural image of that to which it is applied. And this is interesting because it seems to convey a belief that the name contains some of the essence of the prototype. So in this case of Christ, it would be his divinity, over the visual representation, which was an artificial image and had no divine essence. So this is not to say necessarily that viewers and readers would have always read Christ's naming inscriptions through these specific terms, but rather it goes to show that iota sigma chi sigma did not necessarily serve the purpose of identification and was invested with great theological significance. And in the same way, in some way, the real person, Jesus Christ, might have been perceived to contain some of the true essence of the prototype. So, if Christ's written name was on one level believed to bind the image of Christ to the prototype through means of a shared name, how did other titles applied to Christ, such as those in the Met Museum icon, work? These names could not serve the same function, as there is one single prototype, the real Jesus Christ. And therefore, Christ Emmanuel, Christ Pantepoptes, and Christ Nika all point to the same person. What else then are these other titles trying to do? So here I think it's important to look into the origins and meanings and comparable uses of each of these additional names. So starting in the centre, we have Christ Pantepoptes, the all-seeing. So this is not a popular title used to describe Christ or God in the Bible, with the exact wording only used once in the book of Maccabees. Instead, Pantepoptes might derive from Middle Byzantine hymns, where the title is used several times to describe both Christ and to describe God. And the Met Museum icon might be the only surviving Byzantine image where Christ is inscribed with this epithet. Although the other day I did find an image of Christ Pantepoptes from this church in Castoria in northern Greece. But I know that there's been repainting in this church. I need to kind of look at this a bit further. However, Christ is referred to as Pantepoptes in two surviving dome inscriptions that surround images of Christ from Middle Byzantium. So the one we've got on the screen here is for the church of Panagia Theotokos in Trichomo in Cyprus. And there's another one in Plaza in Greece too. And the inscription here isn't strictly an epithet, and it just kind of it's this highlighted bit in yellow. And notably, there are also at least two Byzantine monasteries dedicated to Christ Pantepoptes, including notably one in Constantinople, which is founded by Anna Dalaseni, who was a member of the Komnenian dynasty in the 11th century. And this is notable because it means that the Met Museum icon could potentially be making a toponymic reference to the monastery through means of a shared name. And we know other comparable epithets, such as Pantocrator, which means all ruler, were inscribed on objects associated with Pantocrator monasteries in Constantinople and on Mount Athos. However, we cannot be certain of the Pantepoptes icon's point of reference, as it is totally divorced from its original context. And the inscription might be simply referring to hymns or just describing the authority of Christ, something reiterated by the image's centrality and the enthroned iconography. And moving outwards, on the top two rows of the outer plaques, Christ is named Emmanuel. And this is a title that perhaps might be more familiar to us. So the name itself is derived from the Old and New Testaments in passages that relate to the prophecy and fulfillment of God taking on human form in the incarnation. So in Isaiah it's written, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel." And then this passage is quoted in Matthew 1, 22-23. All of this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. So it's important to note that in the New Testament, the Hebrew transliteration Emmanuel is accompanied by a translation. So it's explained that this means God with us. And unlike Pantepoptes, which is perhaps unique in its survival as an epithet, Emmanuel survives in many instances. It's inscribed on dozens of imperial seals and coins from the late 10th century onwards, and shown alongside an image of the adult Christ. And I think these seals are really interesting because they show a bit of iconographic variation, because Emmanuel is frequently but not exclusively used to inscribe the image of the young Christ, something that I will talk about in the final part of my lecture. And lastly, we have Nika, which means conquers. And unlike Emmanuel and Pantepoptes, this is not strictly an epithet. So here instead we have an indicative verb, which is a form used to express fact in Byzantine Greek. And Nika had special significance in Christianity from the 4th century onwards, with the historian Eusebius describing how Emperor Constantine was told in a vision to paint the word onto his soldiers' shields at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, along with the Kiro, which are the first letters of Christ's name in Greek. And to my knowledge, the Pantepoptes icon is the only surviving instance where Nika is used to inscribe a figurative image of Christ, with the inscription being far more frequently inscribed on crosses, which were displayed on church walls, on coins, or on the back of icons, like this one here from St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai, which Walter Frollo has convincingly argued served an apotropaic function. So I will think more about the relationship that these inscriptions have with Christological iconographies and functions in the next sections. But it's worth stressing that by focusing on naming inscriptions, we can see how this one object sought to understand and define Christ. The one, Jesus Christ, could be the all-seeing, Emmanuel, God with us, or one that conquers. And I mentioned this in passing already, but the Pantepoptes icon is not unique in its use of epithets to define and describe Christ. To my knowledge, there are at least 28 different names and titles used to inscribe over 200 Byzantine images of Christ. So like Pantepoptes, the all-seeing, and Nika, the one that conquers, there are other names that stress the supremacy and transcendental nature of Christ. So we get names like King of Glory, which is on the Man of Sorrows icon on the left. But we also get Pantocrator, which I've mentioned already, which means all ruler. And other titles include things like Awesome Judge too. And like Emmanuel, there are names and titles that derive from the Bible too. So King of Glory again, which is making a psalmist and perhaps an apocryphal reference. We get Land of the Living as well, which is again a reference to one of the Psalms. Saviour and Son of God, which we've got inscribed here on the Ascension icon from St. Catherine's Monastery. And elsewhere, we have names that stress Christ's role as Saviour, but also his benevolence too. So titles like Life Giver, Light Giver, Supremely Good, Redeemer, and Merciful, and so on, So we've got Christ the Merciful depicted in this micro-mosaic icon from Berlin. And even though we have single epithets on these objects, I think they serve a similar function to that of those on the Pantepoptes icon. They define who Christ is and what he can do. And somewhat surprisingly, to my knowledge, there is no single theological treatise that is solely devoted to Christ's name in Byzantium. Despite the fact that he receives numerous naming inscriptions on various Byzantine works of art, and receives about 55 different names and titles in the Bible, and many, many more in Byzantine texts, so things like theological texts, liturgical texts, and hymns. There are, however, numerous Byzantine texts that deal with God's names, which I think provide a very useful framework for understanding Christ's naming inscriptions in Byzantine art, and on specific objects like the Pantepoptes icon. So notably, we have the late 5th, early 6th century text by Pseudo-Dionysius on the divine names, which kind of builds on the biblical affirmation that God's true essence and name are beyond human comprehension. But on the other hand, God is not totally unknowable and reveals himself through his kind of manifestations and activities. And as a result of this, while God has one true name, he also has many names, with Pseudo-Dionysius providing some short lists in his writing, which include things like good, provider of life, and king of kings. And this text on the divine name was popular and influential in Middle and Late Byzantium. So Patriarch Photios has a copy in his personal library in the 9th century. Zygobenos includes a version in his dogmatic panoply in the 12th century. And the text was also directly referenced in a 14th century piece of writing by Neophytos Prodromenos, who kind of used Pseudo-Dionysius as a basis to argue that Armenian Orthodox Christians were heretical, and their deviations from Byzantine Orthodox name inscriptions was evidence of this. But perhaps most notably for what I am looking at, Pseudo-Dionysius' text was paraphrased and his list rewritten and greatly extended by Theodore II Lascaris in the 13th century. So this text here. And although Theodore makes no reference to Christ in this text, he provides a list of 700 names culled from every source, sacred and secular, as he puts it. So I won't subject you to reading the full 700, but what is remarkable here is that there is a really considerable overlap between God's names given by Theodore and those inscribed as epithets on surviving images of Jesus. So these include things like all-seeing, so Pantepoptes, Ancient of Days, life-giver, light-giver, compassionate, the resurrection, the merciful, only Redeemer, Redeemer of the world, Saviour of souls, and the supremely good. So what does this overlap between Christ's and God's nomenclature tell us? Perhaps this is Aristotle's theory of homonyms again, with God and Christ united in essence, but also through shared names too. And I think this is something that's communicated in the Bible and in Byzantine texts as well, as there is notable overlap between the names and titles applied to God and Jesus. So they're both commonly referred to as Saviour, Lord, the Redeemer, King, and so on. And while Byzantine onomastic theologies maintain that God's true name is ultimately unknowable, his activities and manifestations allow him to be named and partially understood, with the ultimate of God's manifestations, of course, being the incarnation, Jesus Christ. And Christ's consubstantiality with God is perhaps most explicitly referenced in this really interesting subset of naming inscriptions that emerge, I think, a little bit later than epithet inscriptions. I need to think more about these. I didn't write about this very much in my PhD thesis. So these are the inclusion of ho on, which roughly translates to he who is. And these are inscribed in, always as far as I know, in the arms of the cross in Christ's halo. And this inscription is really interesting because it is a direct reference to specific passages in the Greek Bible, including God's refusal to provide Moses with his true name in Exodus. And it's also one of God's self-designations in the book of Revelation. So through the inclusion of this inscription in Christ's halo, we are reminded that God and his true name are unknowable. But on the other hand, he is knowable through manifestations. And his many names, including ho-on, applied to Christ here, but also Saviour and Life-giver, as in the icon on the left, and Awesome Judge in the image on the right, which are two of the 700 names of God listed by Theodore II Lascaris in his version of On the Divine Names. And I think this helps us understand the Pantepoptes icon's epithets, which can also be read as titles that stress Christ's relationship with God. So first, there is Emmanuel, which literally means God with us, with that translation provided in the New Testament. And it's a name that's used to describe the incarnation itself. Second, we have Nika, conquers, which is a uniquely verbal title. And here it establishes Christ's role as conqueror over death, which was the ultimate mission of God taking on human flesh, but also kind of highlights the soteriological role of Christ too. And finally, there is Pantepoptes, a title used to refer to God in Maccabees and in various Byzantine hymns. So this title establishes Christ as a powerful and transcendental being. So I think that kind of going through the naming inscriptions of the Pantepoptes icon, we have an object that is preoccupied with Christological and theological comprehension. And by compiling different names for Christ across the visual schema, we understand the different ways in which both God and Christ could enact, manifest, be known, and be named. Issues that have preoccupied Byzantine theology since the earliest centuries. So, done with theology now. Having looked at how these names define Christ and have the ability to explore his relationship with God, I now want to think about how these names might work in practice. What it meant for people to use this object with these names and titles inscribed. So, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, we don't really know anything about the origins of this object. But what does the object itself tell us? So we've got a very high detail of carving, and originally the Pantepoptes icon would have had a really bright green colour, which would be very valued for works in steatite. So you totally lose that now on the front, but the back of the icon has a really kind of bright green appearance. And these are probably indications that it was used by someone from the upper echelons of Byzantine society. It's also a really small object, which certainly indicates to me, I think, intimate and very personal usage. But that being said, there isn't a huge amount of evidence for physical handling, despite steatite's very soft and fragile nature. So the Pantepoptes icon and its carvings are in very good condition, especially compared to other works of art in steatite, which have been considerably worn down over time and evidence of kind of physical handling. But I think this icon was clearly a devotional object, and the wealth of images and inscriptions invite and reward a prolonged and intense viewership. So in the center, we have an iconic non-narrative image of Christ. And we also, on the outer plaques, have Christ's relationship to the devout and faithful visualized. So he's kind of blessing various groups of individuals, so the prophets, the apostles, and saints, all of which will ultimately lead to salvation, as prefigured in the Old Testament narrative of the 3 Hebrew boys. And in her catalogue of Byzantine works in steatite, Yoli Kalavrezu posits that such steatite icons were a popular choice for private devotional objects, for use in a home or in a private chapel, perhaps. And Kalavrezu also kind of argues that this was particularly true of objects with Christological cycles, like this one here, which he argues would serve a similar devotional, doctrinal, and theological function to the equivalent scenes that you would see in a kind of monumental Byzantine church, in fresco or in mosaic. But ultimately, we don't have any concrete information about who used the icon, where, or why. Elsewhere, however, we do have written accounts that describe devotion to images of Christ whose identity is specified by means of an epithet, as well as numerous instances where devotional acts are visualized as donor portraits. And these are important and useful because they begin to show how users kind of anticipated images of Christ and how they anticipated how the images of Christ would function. And they also go to show how Christ's image could be utilized for socio-political gain by members of the Byzantine elite. In that, by specifying the name of Christ with an epithet, certain individuals could kind of in turn bolster and promote their own sense of identity. So one of the clearest and best known examples comes in the account of Empress Zoe and the devotion she shows to her icon of Christ Pantepoptes, which means the one who responds. So this act of devotion is described in Michael Psellos's Chronographia, which forms a history of the Byzantine Macedonian imperial dynasty from the 10th and 11th centuries. So in this much longer text, there is a short passage titled Concerning the Antiphanetes, which describes Empress Zoe's engagement with her own special and personal icon of Christ, which is now lost. So the image we've got on the screen is a much later icon that uses the same epithet and probably doesn't have any relationship to Zoe's original one. So in the text, Psellos describes Zoe's intimate and personal engagement with the icon. He writes, "She made for herself an image of Jesus, fashioning it with as much accuracy as she could. I myself have often seen her, in moments of great distress, clasp the sacred object in her hands, contemplate it, talk to it as though it were indeed alive, and address it with one sweet term of endearment after another." And what's particularly notable is how Zoe's icon had the ability to change colour, which she used to predict the future. So Psellos writes, "If she saw the image turn pale, she would go away crestfallen. But if it took on a fiery red colour, its halo lustrous with a beautiful radiant light, she would lose no time in telling the empress and prophesying what the future was to bring forth." And later, Psellos goes into detail about Zoe's rituals with the icon, which includes things like touching, kissing, and lighting incense, things that were not necessarily unusual in Byzantine devotion. What is unusual, however, at this point in Byzantine history is how Zoe seems to build a very special relationship around this particular named image. As Psellos puts it himself, Zoe's religious ceremonies, however, for all their attention to detail, were not conducted after the Greek or any other style. She worshipped God in her own way. So, frustratingly, in Psellos' text, it's not clear whether the icon was actually inscribed with an epithet or not. So Psellos might actually just be describing the icon's perceived responsive characteristics. And this is something that comes up an awful lot with other Byzantine descriptions of lost images of Christ. But I'm not sure this really matters with the case of Zoe and Christ Pantepoptes. Because, crucially, the relationship between Zoe and her icon of Christ Pantepoptes does not stay private. We see the same epithet appearing on her coinage and in monumental decoration in the now lost mosaics of the Koimisis church in Nicaea, which we know she commissioned. Zoe also had a church founded in Constantinople, which was dedicated to Antiphanetes, and this is a place where she was eventually buried. So I think it's quite easy to see what Zoe is doing here. She is associating herself publicly and quite consistently with one particular version of Christ, Christ Pantepoptes, one that she had a close, personal, and, as Psellos puts it, idiosyncratic relationship with. In other words, naming becomes a way of kind of branding devotion, making a special and almost cultic relationship visible. And we see similar things happening again with John II Komnenos in the 12th century, who founds a monastery dedicated to Christ Pantocrator, which means all-ruler, in Constantinople. And in the Typicon, which is kind of a deed for the running of the monastery, it's described that there is an icon there with an epithet, and images associated with the monastery, such as kind of lead seals, were also inscribed with Christ Pantocrator. And the use of this title is particularly interesting because Pantocrator is perhaps the kind of best known Christological epithet. But at this point in the 12th century, it hadn't really been used at all in Byzantine art, with John's seals for the monastery being amongst the earliest surviving examples of the epithet. And also the kind of title Pantocrator, or ruler, has a certain kind of Christo-mimetic quality as well, in that Christ is the supreme all-ruler, whereas John, a Byzantine emperor, is Christ, God's representative, the earthly ruler. And if we move forward to the 14th century, in his famous mosaic cycle from the Cora Church, Theodore Metahetes, who's the guy with the fabulous hat on the left there, he had a series of images inscribed Ikora ton zonton, which means the land of the living. And these are located across the main east-west axis of the church. So the name itself is a reference to the Psalms, but it's also a pun on the name of the church, which is Cora, which in Byzantine Greek on one level means countryside, and refers to the location of the church, which would have originally been outside of the city walls of Constantinople. But Cora is also a very complex name, and it had a long-standing metaphysical association relating to kind of creation and salvation and the afterlife as well. So it's quite complex stuff that's going on here with Theodore Metahetes. And what Metahetes is doing here is quite deliberate, I think, and similar to Zoe. and I think perhaps speaks of his own imperial aspirations. So he's not an emperor, he's the Byzantine equivalent to a prime minister. And because of the kind of specific toponymic reference that the epithet is making, and all of its weighty connotations, Pantepoptes has created his own unique type of Christ, something that he also articulates in his poetry. So he writes, "To thee I have dedicated this noble monastery called by the precious name of Cora." And this special relationship is visualized in the donor portrait, which leads from the inner narthex to the naos of the church. It's this kind of main entrance route into the church, where there's this kind of interesting paradoxical exchange that goes on between Christ and Theodore Pantepoptes. So here, Christ is inscribed the land, or Cora, of the living, but he's also presented with a model of the Cora church by Pantepoptes. And I think it's also worth noting the significance of these naming inscriptions, kind of recognized by later visitors. So in the middle of the 14th century, the Patriarch of Constantinople remarks on these kind of special inscriptions when he visits the church. And the cases of Zoe and John II Komnenos and Theodore Pantepoptes represent imperial and elite patronage and devotional practices, which result in the cultivation of special relationships with Christ, which are communicated by means of epithets. And I think this kind of relationship between Christ's names and imperial/elite identity can be seen very clearly in Byzantine seals. So you see images of Christ on Byzantine seals far more often in imperial seals than those not belonging to non-imperial individuals. And interestingly, a significant number of these imperial seals feature epithet inscriptions. So you get titles like Redeemer, Pantocrator, Philanthropos, which means lover of humanity. And as identified by John Coxonis, the overwhelming majority of these seals that include epithet inscriptions do not feature invocations. So frequently on seals, you'd have kind of text saying, "Lord, help so-and-so," refer to the person that the seal belongs to. You don't get these with imperial seals that have epithets. And Kotsonis convincingly argues, I think, that the lack of invocations, that presence of epithets, imply that imperial powers, male and female alike, did not need to place themselves in a subordinate or supplicatory position to the divine in their official imagery. Instead, epithets are used to communicate the close rule and relationship that these individuals have with Jesus Christ himself. So, going back to the Pantepoptes icon, how does this inform our understanding of who used it and how the inscriptions informed that use? So I'm not saying that the Pantepoptes icon had an imperial patron, but rather inscriptions speak to the relationship that the user had with Christ. And this is something that can get manipulated for socio-political gain by certain individuals. But it's also worth noting that in terms of non-imperial donor portraiture that use epithets, we have kind of a wider range of titles. So we get things like merciful, or ruler, the one who fulfills, light giver, which I think speaks to the varieties of anticipated responses for the respective images of Christ. And with these kind of non-elite and non-imperial examples, most of the examples are not unique in their survival. So this can't be about cultivating a unique relationship per se, but rather the epithets communicate what each interaction was about. how Christ reacts to the acts of devotion. And as kind of well put by Georgy Papalov, he states that these epithets are about shortening the emotional distance between the viewer and the image. And I think that really kind of hits the nail on the head there. And in terms of the Pantepoptes icon, the outer plaques in particular communicate the relationship that Christ has with different groups of individuals. And this is interesting because it goes to explain why the same image of the youthful Christ has different names on the Pantepoptes icon. So on the top, Christ Emmanuel, God with us, floats above the prophets. And these are the people who foretold the incarnation. Below that, we have Christ Emmanuel again, God with us. And here he floats above the apostles, those who witnessed and recorded the incarnation. Then, on the lower registers, we have Christ Nika, Jesus Christ conquers. And he's inscribed that for the church fathers and military saints. So these groups did not prophesy or witness the incarnation, but they will achieve salvation because of it, because Christ is the one who conquers death. And finally, we have a simple naming inscription, just Jesus Christ, for the medical saints and Constantine and Helena. So I thought long and hard about this. And the only reason I can think for this kind of standard insignia is simply one of logistics. There was not enough room on the epigraphic friezes. So here, it was more important for saints to receive their naming inscriptions, because all saints have their names inscribed in Byzantine art, than it was for Christ to receive these additional descriptive titles. You just need his standard name. And I think this is important because it serves a reminder to us that epithet inscriptions were always the exception and rather than the rule in Byzantine art. So finally, I want to quickly think about the ways in which we modern viewers use certain epithets to describe images of Christ. So these essentially become shorthand for so-called iconographic types. And this is important because when you actually start to look at the images and the inscriptions, there is far from a clear-cut relationship. So on the Pantepoptes icon, we have Emmanuel, used to inscribe the image of the young Christ. And this is probably unsurprising to anyone who knows anything about Byzantine art, as Emmanuel is very commonly used to describe any image of the young Christ, whether he is inscribed with that title or not. As the Oxford Dictionary of Byzantium puts it, the Emmanuel image, or iconographic type, is a frontal, beardless youth with curly locks pushed behind his ears, a high forehead, and a cross halo. So this kind of close relationship between title and image kind of makes sense on one level, because the biblical references to Emmanuel point to virgin conception and birth, and therefore a young Christ iconography seems to be the most appropriate choice for this name. But in reality, the picture is more complicated than that. The title Emmanuel, despite being more popular for images of the young Christ, was not the only iconographic use for the inscription. So notably, in early Byzantine art, we have an image that looks to us like the Ancient of Days, so a prophetic vision that Daniel has. But interestingly here, we have the epithet Emmanuel inscribed. And Kathleen Corrigan has kind of argued convincingly that the use of this inscription for this particular image was part of early Byzantine anxieties around the nature of these Old Testament visions, meaning that the Ancient of Days, as described in the book of Daniel, becomes a pre-existent form of the Logos, or the Incarnation, rather than God the Father, because you can't see God the Father, and Daniel describes the vision that he has in his account. So Corrigan kind of argues that the Emmanuel inscription is used as a typological reference about kind of prophesizing the incarnation and coming into reality. And it points to incarnation rather than points to infancy. And centuries later, there are dozens of imperial seals from the 10th and 11th centuries that do not depict the young Christ, but rather the adult Christ, bearded, one that we might refer to as Pantocrator, although I'm going to try and change your mind about that in a moment. And here, I think Emmanuel is probably being used for its meaning God with us, which speaks to Byzantine imperial ideology, where the emperor was God's representative on earth. And finally, for Emmanuel, there is an eschatological image of the adult beardless Christ depicted in majesty, but inscribed Emmanuel on the west arch of the monastery of Archangel Michael in North Macedonia from the 14th century. And here as well, interestingly, we have ho on, so he who is, inscribed in the halo. And here again, the epithet refers to the return of the incarnation. That is, Emmanuel, God with us, who's coming back at the Last Judgment. So the question here is, what do all of these do to the idea of Emmanuel as a strict iconographic type? Are the images on the outer plaques of the Pantepoptes, Pantepoptes icon, the correct iconographic use for the epithet? And should all other instances be understood as deviations from this norm? I don't think so. I think these show that the relationship between image and text in Byzantium is far more fluid than we give it credit for. And by combining Emmanuel with different iconographies, Byzantine artists could stress different qualities in both the name and the inscribed images. And I think this idea is strengthened when we look at the lower registers of the Pantepoptes icon. Because here, Christ Emmanuel, as the Met Museum website puts it, is not inscribed Emmanuel at all, but Nika. And I think these are really interesting and important because they go to show that there isn't really such a thing as an iconographic type in Byzantium, but rather there was no issue with inscribing the same image with different titles, and also that the same name could be used for different images. And this is something we can observe when we look at other epithets very closely associated with certain iconographies. So the name Pantocrator, meaning all ruler, is practically ubiquitous in Byzantine art scholarship for describing images like this, that of the adult Christ in a bust, holding a gospel book that can be open or closed, and in a gesture of blessing. And sometimes this image could actually be inscribed Pantocrator, such as the one on the far left. However, like Emmanuel, the iconographic use of the epithet is far more varied. Despite the ubiquity of the title Pantocrator in scholarship, there aren't actually that many images inscribed with the title in Byzantine art. It only really becomes common in kind of post-Byzantine art from the 15th, 16th centuries onwards. So there's only about 22 or so kind of true Byzantine images that inscribe the image as Pantocrator. And these vary iconographically. So we can have Christ in a bust, our so-called kind of typical or correct Pantocrator type. But he could also be standing or enthroned or alone or part of a so-called deosis. So this is when he's flanked by the Mother of God and John the Baptist. He could even be dressed in gold and holding a sword. To me, this doesn't look like a rigid iconographic type. And if we look at images of the so-called iconographic Pantocrator type, these images could be inscribed with a wide variety of names too. So these could be things like Antiphanetes, the one who responds, Elaimon, the merciful, King of glory, Saviour and life giver, wisdom of God, and the list goes on and on. And this range of different names used to inscribe the image of Christ demonstrates how images themselves did not necessarily have a fixed meaning in Byzantium. Rather, I think that they were fundamentally open signs until an epithet inscription was added. And this ultimately restricts what the image could mean and how viewers and users should engage with it. And finally, one particularly telling example is the famous 6th century icon from St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai, Egypt. So when the icon was first published in the middle of the 20th century, it was heavily overpainted. And after cleaning, very faint traces of an epithet inscription reading Philanthropos, lover of humanity, were revealed. So these are very hard to see. So it's these flickers of red paint here and here. So I've got to trust Kurt Weitzman that there is an epithet inscription somewhere there. And it's estimated that this inscription would have been added onto the icon perhaps in the 13th century, but definitely in Middle or Late Byzantium. However, in subsequent scholarship, the icon has not been referred to as Philanthropos at all, but has instead been consistently referred to as Pantocrator. And the issue is that this has serious implications on how we, as modern viewers, approach the icon. Using Pantocrator as shorthand to describe this and other uninscribed images of the adult Christ, or images inscribed with different names altogether, leads us to understand said image of Christ in a very specific way. So Pantocrator, as I've said a few times, means all ruler. But it seems that this was not the quality that the Byzantines sought to stress. For whoever repainted this icon and whoever subsequently read the inscription, this was an image of the human loving Christ. And this is even further problematized by the fact that Pantocrator is anachronistic for early Byzantine images. There is no evidence that the term Pantocrator was applied to this kind of image until Middle Byzantium, centuries after this icon was originally made. So using the term Pantocrator to refer to this icon actually distances us from the ways in which we know that the Byzantines understood and used this object. And this is not to say that older uninscribed images like this one were only read in one fixed way, but rather later on in its life, the meaning of this image was pinned down by means of an epithet. So, returning to the Pantepoptes icon for the last time. We don't know where or when it was made, who made it, or how it looked originally. However, I hope that I've shown that by focusing on Christ's name on the icon, we can begin to understand how it might have been used and understood. Naming inscriptions were far from passive identifiers in Byzantium, but rather small bits of evidence of how the Byzantines perceived the image of Christ to function, informed by long-standing onomastic and epigraphic theologies and philosophies. As on the Pantepoptes icon, these inscriptions could describe the nature and activity of the incarnation, whilst also stressing Christ and God's shared natures by means of common onomastic vocabularies. These names could also speak to the relationship that groups and individuals had with Christ. Some people prophesied the incarnation, some people witnessed it, others received salvation because of it. while others, like Empress Zoe and Theodore Metahetes, use names as a sort of branding tool to promote the relationship that they had with him as patrons of art. While for others, epithets spoke to what Christ, through his image, could do for them. He could give them light or life, he could show them mercy, he could love them, or he could be the powerful King of glory or the ruler of heaven. And finally, looking at these types of inscriptions as a whole demonstrates that epithets did not call for a specific iconographic response. Things were far more fluid than that. Epithets could tease out more nuanced readings of the images, and images could do the same for the epithets. And ultimately, I think these inscriptions are hugely undervalued and an underused tool for understanding certain Byzantine images of Christ, particularly obscure ones like this. Something that is perhaps best demonstrated by the fact that Pantepoptes is still misspelled on the Met Museum website. Thank you very much.